This video is sponsored by World Anvil. This is the next video in my Villains series. In my previous installment, I discussed the factors that make a great D&D villain. This time, I just want to declare, definitively, which are the absolute best D&D villains. Okay, obviously I'm being hyperbolic. I've discussed this before. I don't tend to read a lot of published adventures. A lot of the villains I like I've learned about from a few that I've read, or the actual play shows I've seen, or just from cultural osmosis from being in this hobby for almost 16 years. So let's be super clear here. This list is wildly subjective. If you can think of a terrific villain from the history of D&D that isn't on this list, let me know in the comments below, and make sure to specify where they can be found to make it easier for those of us who want to look into these villains and their adventures and deploy them at our tables. By the way, if you take this opportunity to, put the name of an employee of Wizards of the Coast, I'm just gonna block you. That's not what I mean, you know what I mean. We're not doing that today. Number 6. Orcus. First on this list, in no particular order, is Orcus, the Demon Prince of Undeath. I'm not basing this off of any particular adventure or lore, I just like his vibe. Okay, that's not entirely true. To be honest, even though I've never played in or run a campaign that featured Orcus, he has always represented the quintessential D&D big bad to me. This goes all the way back to the very first season of Acquisitions Incorporated in 2008, when the cast played through the very first 4th edition adventure, Keep on the Shadowfell. That module is structured around cultists of Orcus trying to open a portal to the Shadowfell, and ever since then, Orcus has felt like the default for the ultimate evil threat in D&D. Especially since my 4th edition group just deeply loved the Raven Queen goddess, Orcus always felt like an especially personal enemy to her, which made him really exciting to me. And yeah, I think the act of learning about him through an actual play show made a big impact on me. This was long before Critical Role came along, so Acquisitions Incorporated was the D&D show that inspired me for a long time. And the presentation of lore through those early adventures meant not only that those elements of lore stuck in my head, but tying them to an adventuring group run by Chris Perkins, the most famous internet content DM until 2015, made that lore feel especially iconic to D&D in a way that I really enjoyed. Plus, look, Orcus's design is just killer. Pun actually intended that time. And the fact that Orcus's horns played a role in the earliest on-screen Critical Role adventure just further cemented the idea that Orcus is the big bad of D&D. Of course, I don't really hold that same esteem for Orcus these days. He's been overthrown by some other iconic villains who are more my speed. But more on them later. Number 5. Halaster Blackcloak. When Wizards of the Coast was getting ready to launch 5th edition, the Acquisitions Incorporated podcast moved over to the Forgotten Realms, since that's where most 5e adventures would go on to take place. And in their first adventure with Patrick Rothfuss in 2013, they went down into Undermountain, a mega dungeon beneath Waterdeep. The entire premise of Undermountain was just that this one wizard went so deeply, wildly insane that he built an extremely elaborate dungeon complex beneath Waterdeep. I don't know if that's 1000% accurate, that's how the lore was simplified and presented for the podcast. And the way each room was presented by Chris Perkins was simply fascinating. They were each just excellent excuses for the wildest stuff Perkins could throw into the adventure. There was a pair of statues that did the whole one tells the truth, the other one lies thing, but because of how they said it, the answer wasn't as simple as you might think. There was a giant version of one of those frog instrument things that spit out random stuff when they played it, like a slod control gem or the burst of poison gas. There was a door that led to the elemental plane of air. There was a snake room that was absolutely not what they expected. There was a room with a tiny wizard trapped in a cage and another wizard who'd been turned into a gray ooze. And all of this helps to paint the picture of Halaster Blackcloak as a truly deranged wizard who created a dungeon that can contain literally anything you want to throw at your players. I think it's fair to classify this version of Undermountain as a funhouse dungeon. Whether or not that's true for the other iterations of Undermountain, it sure was true in this case. And I just think that's such a compelling villain because he opens the door to a ton of story potential for your campaigns. Of course, Halaster is designed to function best in a world like the Forgotten Realms, but I'd argue he could be dropped into any campaign setting without much difficulty. And if you're creating a campaign setting of your own, you can't go wrong if you sign up for today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is an online resource that you can use to keep track of all the relevant details of your world, including lore about villains, events, villains, magic items, villains, monsters, villains, friendly NPCs, and even entire nations, especially if they're ruled by villains. Plus, World Anvil has a whole host of tools that allow you to add information to an article that only you can see, so that you can keep track of your villains' plans and secrets without spoiling them for your players. And World Anvil is offering a discount to viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 40% off of any annual membership. Thank you again so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Honorable mention, Demogorgon. Before we move on, I want to jump over to my first honorable mention in this video. Yeah, I'm not saving them for the end like most YouTubers do, I'm dropping them in whenever I want to. I'm unpredictable. But there's a name we have to discuss when talking about villains in D&D. The Demogorgon. This was a monster I was already familiar with, I think. I knew he was on the cover of the 4th edition second monster manual, so even though I never owned that book, I just sort of think I just knew about him. In fact, I think I actually learned about him through an animated video made to promote that book. But then, in 2014, everyone learned his name thanks to a little TV show called Stranger Things, borrowing the name for their Season 1 monster. Of course, the monster in Stranger Things didn't look anything like the Demogorgon of the game, it was just an extended analogy that became iconically linked to that monster. And that's a pretty huge problem with the Demogorgon. How severely he got overshadowed by a creature that stole his name. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why am I docking points from a D&D monster because of how it's depicted when it's not even really an adaptation of that monster? Well, first, because it's my list, I do what I want. But also, I think it does speak to an issue with the Demogorgon that it could just be easily reduced to a monster with a cool name. Just going down my own personal preference, I don't think Demogorgon is as exciting as a demon lord compared to Orcus. And his other most exciting quality is that he has two heads that can argue with each other, which can also be said for our next villain. So again, just from my own personal opinion, based on what little I know about him, there just isn't a lot about the Demogorgon that excites me, at least not in the ways that I don't think other villains do better. Number 4, Tiamat. Tiamat is a 5-headed dragon queen goddess. Each head resembles the head of a different chromatic dragon, and she's the focus of tons of cults. Honestly, Tiamat doesn't stand out to me because of her dragonness. I find that she's less exciting and compelling than just a regular ancient dragon, maybe that's just me. But what makes Tiamat work is how incredibly versatile she can be for your needs. If you need a goddess for any cult to serve with any final agenda, she works great as their inspiration or their patron. And while I know the question of whether or not Tiamat is also Takesis from Dragonlance is a sensitive subject for some longtime fans, M from Unimportant Hero made a terrific video about that. Check it out if you want to hear a longtime Dragonlance fan weigh in with her feelings on that topic. The fact is, Tiamat can just as easily be used as the inspiration or the patron for an army of knights, or an army of dragons, or an army of knights who ride on an army of dragons. And she has a bunch of great options for motivations. Does she want a great big horde? Sure, she's a dragon. Does she want to conquer the land? Sure, she's a queen. Does she want the followers of another god to be murdered? Sure, she's a goddess. There's a lot to like here, and she's the kind of evil divine being that anybody can honor for any reason, and including her makes it a lot easier to justify any dragon appearing in your campaign. And any excuse to get more dragons in our D&D games is a good thing. Number 3, Vecna. Of course, while we're talking about divine beings who would make excellent villains, we should shift over to Vecna. We're in the midst of a minor Vecna renaissance thanks to his appearance in the Vox Machina campaign of Critical Role, his role as the inspiration for the Season 4 villain of Stranger Things, and that cool statue that Wizards of the Coast made last year that has a version of Vecna that has both eyes and both hands, because I don't really know why. I have mixed feelings about this design. There's a lot I like about it, and a lot that I don't. But I've really liked Vecna ever since his appearances on Critical Role, and Vecna shifts us into a new category of villains who I really, really like. Villains who can sit down and talk with the heroes. Orcus feels more like a force of nature, or a sinister presence only to be dealt with from far away. Tiamat is, a 5-headed dragon. She works best in that context. But Vecna can stroll into the room and sit down with the heroes and have a chat, and feel completely safe in the knowledge that nothing done to him will matter. He'll always be fine. Plus, he's got some really cool lore regarding his missing body parts, and his former ally turned relentless enemy, Cass the Bloody-Handed. Plus, Vecna also serves as the foe for gods of death, like the Raven Queen, so in a lot of ways, he covers some of the same domains as Orcus, but in a way that lends itself toward a more interesting personality. He's sort of replaced Orcus and become the new platonic ideal for the big bad of a long-running campaign, in my mind. He's a terrific god of undeath and secrets, and just an awesome Lich enemy. But he's not the only Lich enemy we've got on our plate today. Number 2. Acererak. Let's talk about Acererak, because I didn't have much of an opinion about Acererak until I finally sat down and played through the Tomb of Horrors and read a bit of Tomb of Annihilation, and now I really like Acererak. He's another Lich, and he's the creator of the Tomb of Horrors, and the main villain of the Tomb of Annihilation. I'd worry about that being a spoiler, except he's on the cover, and I don't think it actually changes much about that adventure if you know that. And he's specifically unlike most other super famous D&D Liches because, according to the lore, he has no interest in becoming a god, which means, kind of like Halaster Blackcloak, he could just be doing whatever you want. In Tomb of Annihilation, he's trying to create a new god, presumably because he just thinks that will be easier than trying to become a god, while still serving his own god complex. Tomb of Horrors is just a meat grinder for adventurers, and there are a ton of traps in that dungeon that were apparently crafted out of pure pettiness. Not just on the part of Gary Gygax, but also canonical pettiness on Acererak's part. The fact that he's just this supervillain who can appear anywhere you want, be behind any evil plan, and then, because he's a Lich, he can get slain and it's totally not a big deal because he'll just reform next to his phylactery, gives him a lot of incredible, versatile story potential for any campaign. Honorable mention number 2, Yansi Bin. My second and final honorable mention goes to Yansi Bin, the evil Prince of Air from Princes of the Apocalypse. The reason he just gets an honorable mention is because all the things that were fun about running Yansi Bin in my game had nothing to do with how he's written in the campaign. In the book, he's got some cool art. He's the most human-looking evil prince. He basically looks like he's made out of wind and sand. It's cool. But that's kind of all he is. In our game, for some reason I can't recall, he wound up frequently having psychic conversations with our Air Genasi party member. He would just show up and taunt her, or prod her for information, or try to recruit her to his side. My players made a very astute observation, one that I did not intend, but I think lined up really nicely. Yansi Bin and our Air Genasi sort of had a Kylo Ren and Rey dynamic from The Last Jedi. They could talk across any distance, and at one point, our party member initiated it instead of Yansi Bin, opening the lines of communication from her end. It was fascinating to see that play out at the table. But of course, none of that is in the campaign book. That was something that developed organically in our game and added a ton of complexity to the story. Remember earlier I mentioned how much I like villains who can sit down and talk to the heroes? Adding that element to Yansi Bin did so much to bring that character to life. He was so much more interesting than the other evil princes because he became personified. And the fact that he could get into our Air Genasi's head and try to mess with her, taunt her, and manipulate her allowed us to kind of let him reflect some toxic behavior that the players could then defeat. At the end of the campaign, Yansi Bin was not dead, but he had effectively lost a lot of his resources and his power. And in the final scene, he appeared to the Air Genasi while she was sitting on a beach relaxing, and he tried to taunt her, and she ignored him. And as he basically demanded that she look at him, acknowledge him, respect him, she didn't, and his image blew away into sand. It was a really cool moment about denying power to those who would use it to hurt you, and I was really happy with how it played out. And if you understand why I enjoyed that version of Yansi Bin, you can probably already guess who my favorite D&D villain is, and why. Number 1. Strahd von Zarovich. The final villain I'm going to talk about today is honestly pretty predictable. If you've ever seen a top 10 list of D&D villains, I'm sure a lot of my entries seem familiar, but this one is probably most consistent of all of them. It's Strahd von Zarovich. And listen, I don't know if I'm going to say anything about this villain that nobody else has already said ever, but unlike all the other villains on this list, besides honorable mention Yansi Bin, this is a villain I've actually roleplayed, since I'm currently running Curse of Strahd. And there are two things that make Strahd especially compelling. One of these is something I sort of wish I'd touched on in my previous villains video about what makes a great D&D villain. I don't think it's essential, that's why it's not in the video, but it is something I think some of the best D&D villains do really well, which is why I'm going to talk about it now. These villains are the ultimate, distilled version of some iconic, archetypal monsters. To me, Orcus is the ultimate demon lord. Tiamat is the mother of all dragons in every possible meaning of that expression. Except just for chromatic dragons, but you get my point. Halaster is a fantastic mad wizard. Vecna is a great god of death. Acererak is the ultimate lich. So of course, one thing I love about Strahd is that he's as vampire-y a vampire as any vampire could be. And that brings me to the second thing I like about Strahd. He represents something real. Something awful, but real. Everything else people making this list seem to like about Strahd, his horrific backstory, his sense that he's the good guy, the fact that he's a tragic character, that's all gravy. And sometimes that's a distraction. Strahd is more than just a compelling or a sympathetic villain or whatever people say about him when they're missing the point. The fact is, he's a predator. A very human predator. A gaslighter and an abuser. And I've said this before, the fact that this D&D adventure about hunting an abusive, gaslighting psychopath and making sure he can't hurt anybody else took off with audiences in a huge way after 2017 when the American people elected someone accused of scores of real-world allegations of sexual misconduct, while the Me Too era was shining a light into decades of abuse and coercion. I don't think that's a coincidence. Right now, Strahd is my favorite villain because I get to present a villain who is unapologetically evil, manipulative, and cruel in ways that many of us have seen from the worst human beings in the real world. And then I get to hand my players a bunch of magic weapons and give them a chance to smite him. My Strahd games deal with extremely heavy content, but they allow my players to deal with these concepts in a safe environment, to feel those feelings in a controlled way, and confront them. That is why he is my favorite D&D villain. Thank you so much for watching. As I said, I know not everyone will feel the same way about all of these villains, and I can guarantee that there are some other great villains from published adventures that I didn't touch on. So, once again, let me know in the comments if there's a villain you like, and what module or setting book we can find them in. Also, I'd be willing to make another video on this topic in the future. Because I lied to you. These villains aren't in a totally random order. They're more or less in the order I learned about them, or encountered them, or ran them in my own games. So, if you all recommend a bunch of adventures with awesome villains, and then I run those adventures, I could easily wind up with some more names to add to the next version of this video. If you want to support the channel, there are a few great ways you can do that. You can subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about my videos as soon as they come out. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday, and the sooner you watch a video, the better it performs, and the more YouTube recommends it to more people, and that just helps the channel in a huge way. If you want to support me financially, the easiest way to do that is to sign up for my Patreon. Supporting me at any amount, even just $1 a month, really helps the channel. But you get some cool stuff at other levels as well. $3 a month gets you some bonus D&D published content that Patreon supporters get to see long before anybody else ever will. And $5 a month gets you ad-free, early, and sometimes extended versions of all my videos. If you can't support me financially right now, I completely understand. You can still join my Discord server and hang out with a bunch of awesome people who just like D&D and RPGs and want to support and uplift each other. It's really lovely. And the fourth and final way you can support the channel is by signing up for my newsletter, which is how you will get occasional updates about what I've got going on. We've talked a lot about D&D villains today, but what happens when your players become the villains? I made a video about how to handle a torture scene when it comes up in your games. Check that video out right here. I'm really happy with it. Until next time, play fair and have fun.